And good evening from Philadelphia. Frank here with yet another episode of UFO News Network Sunday, tonight on a Monday. And tonight we've got a very special guest with us. So let me go ahead and bring on my co host, Chant, to do the honors of introducing our fine guest for this evening.
Hey, everybody. We have a really fun person who's a wonderful researcher, and he has a great sense of humor. We love him. His name is Paul Dean, but I just want to let you all know something first. We had an interesting audio interruption there. It's just because our sound was latent for a moment. And so you might have heard a little bit of talking there for a moment, but I'm going to go ahead and move along and introduce our wonderful guest, Paul Dean. Paul Dean is an Australian-based researcher who focuses on government and military involvement and response to the UFO phenomena. Working in total isolation for 20 years, Paul began tackling the issue of so-called UFO files directly just 6 years ago. He, with colleague Keith Basterfield, was instrumental in seeing that the Australian government released hitherto classified files from both the Aussie military and civilian aviation agencies. Further, Paul has delved into hard-to-get UFO files generated by both the U.S. and U.K. government, with some considerable successes. Using the Freedom of Information Act and the mandatory declassification review process to obtain records, he is currently securing information from the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, the Air Force Space Command, AFSPC, and the Federal Aviation Administration. Further, and sometimes more importantly, Paul obtains and studies the FOIA work of researchers who have quit the topic or passed on, including the extraordinary work of the late G. Todd. Lastly, Paul has developed a UFO archive of gigantic size and works with the likes of Barry Greenwood, Jan Aldrich, and NICAP's Francis Ridge in maintaining that resource. That is quite the bio, Paul. You are a very serious researcher. We really love having you on the show. You've been on before. How are you?
Thank you. Oh, pretty good. It's 10 in the morning here, so we're nearly a day ahead of you, I think, or maybe 15 hours ahead of you or something like that. But yeah, I'm going quite well. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, folks actually heard the tail end of our conversation. I was just letting our audience know it was just a little bit of latency regarding a sound. And thank you, audience, for being so patient with us on that. And just wanted to ask Paul, moving on to the topics now, can you talk about the topic with NORAD?
Yeah, this is probably the most overlooked, certainly in the United States or North America. Canada included, obviously. I've studied the UFO topic from the way that government agencies, particularly in the United States, I guess, because their history is so rich there. Your history is so rich. I've studied the US government, whether that be military or the aviation community or the intelligence apparatus. I've studied the UFO, the government's response to the UFO issue for years, and dating right back to how they dealt with it, really from the issue of Foo Fighters with the US Army Air Forces and in Europe and Asia, right through till now, and I guess that it was probably. Look, some years ago, probably about 10 years ago, when I started studying how the US actually deals with things in the sky. So one of your organisations it is the premier and paramount air sovereignty and airspace management from a military side of the house perspective. It's the premier airspace management and air sovereignty organisation in North America. It's the North American Aerospace Defense Command. It's based at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado, with an alternate headquarters at Cheyenne Mountain, also in Colorado. It is a centre. It's a centre that delegates air surveillance to numerous United States Air Force squadrons all around, and Canadian First Air Division squadrons all around.
Yeah, it's a joint Canadian operation.
Yeah, it is a binational organisation, and how it actually works is NORAD. NORAD's parent agency is actually NORTHCOM, which is one of 10 unified combatant commands that is organised directly under the Secretary of Defence and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And then NORAD also simultaneously answers to Canada's, Forces Canada and the Canadian Parliament. And so what NORAD's, NORAD's actual, their current fact sheet, and it's been like this for decades and decades. NORAD's role has never changed. It's never changed, and their current fact sheet, and I quote, is NORAD is, quote, charged with the missions, two main missions, of aerospace warning and aerospace control for North America. Now, aerospace warning includes detection, validation, and warning of attack against North America, whether by aircraft, missiles, or space vehicles, through mutual arrangements with other commands. That would be like Naval Space Command, etc. And then aerospace control includes, ensuring air sovereignty and air defence of the airspace in Canada and the United States. That's things like monitoring ongoing hijackings, developing statistical databases on stray aircraft movements, or studying the future actions of airborne drug runners, etc. So NORAD is like people think NORAD is some centre with just a few massive radars and that's all it is. What NORAD actually is, it's almost like a system of systems. It's like where the United States Air Force at squadron and wing level, who detect with huge primary track-while scan and height-finding radars, the United States Air Force looks in the air 24/7, 24 hours a day, looks for things in primary mode, like literally radar reflective things in the sky, planes, the odd balloon, helicopters, whatever. And that data feed goes to NORAD, as does data from, say, the Naval Space Command, which the Naval Space Command have a system that monitors the movements of space junk in low Earth orbit. Canada's 1st Air Division, which uses both airborne control and warning and ground-based radars to monitor the skies up near the Arctic. That information also goes to NORAD directly. Information from the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, which is actually run by the Air Force Space Command at Vandenberg Air Force Base, that information from the Ballistic Missile Early Warning sites in Alaska and Greenland, and actually in England at Farlingdales, that information gets fed through Vandenberg at the Joint Functional Component Center for Space, and again, NORAD is a customer of that data. So NORAD is this center which has more. I've studied NORAD's capabilities for 10 years, and there is no organisation anywhere like it in the world that can do up-to-date monitoring of such a massive geographical area. So it has always fascinated me as to why ufologists and the media and the press and UFO buffs and even very serious researchers have bashed on the door of the CIA and the DIA, and have bashed on the door of the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Central Intelligence Agency, even some areas of the Air Force, who have long been out of UFOs, like some of the air test development places, the Atomic Energy Commission, and so on. People have been bashing on these organisations, which have yes, they've got some UFO mythology in the past. Yes, they've studied the UFO topic or had concern about it, but ongoing, up to date, day after day, year after year, NORAD and NORAD to a lesser extent, Air Force Space Command and its parent Unified Combat Command, US Stratcom, which is based in Nebraska. They are the ones that actually have the best monitoring and detection capabilities anywhere in the world. And nobody is asking, because they're too hard to deal with. NORAD is astoundingly hard to deal with. To get a straight answer out of them about anything is hard to do. Even congressmen get shown the door. So it became very important for me to start joining dots, and and I've done a lot of work in that area, and it is very important.
Well, real quick, Paul, just to go back a few years, there was a documentary done by CBS News here in the States, hosted by Walter Cronkite, where they did actually get a NORAD spokesman to go on the air and say they've never picked up anything along the lines of a UFO. Which
trash.
Well, yes, of course,
absolute trash. Of course, it's trash. I mean, for starters, we don't know what a UFO is until it's identified. I mean, until a pair of, say, F-15 Eagles or F-16 whatever they're called, until Falcons, until planes, until aircraft or observational aircraft get up next to an object. It could be a balloon, it could be something more mysterious, it could just be a stray missile that's out of control from some sort of test launch that was never properly authorized from White Sands, whatever. The point is that, of course, what he's saying is, what that spokesman will simply be referring to is he's trying to say that we've never picked anything up that scared the hell out of us to the point where we think it's from space, we think it's ET. This is confirmation. Absolute trash that NORAD has never picked up anything of significance that is totally unexplained. They do it all the time. And the great thing is we've actually got the data. We're starting to get the data now. It's a little old. It's from the 80s and 90s, but we're actually starting to get the data. But I mean, certainly in 1975, NORAD was in part responsible for detecting and tracking UFOs, dead set unusual UFO events across the northern tier with Canada, with the aid of local command posts, as in bases, as in air traffic control towers and radar stations at Wordsmith Air Force Base, Loring Air Force Base, Maelstrom Air Force Base, etc. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, at sector level, so Luke Air Force Base detachment and whatever, they were definitely picking up UFOs. We know it because we've got NORAD's very own paperwork. We've got some extraordinary NORAD paperwork that dates back to the 60s and 70s. I'll just give you some examples of the example you just gave me then. Of how, a NORAD spokesman says we've never picked up UFOs. Okay, we've got piles of those sort of statements. I'll give you some examples. On the 10th of November 1975, there's a NORAD's Director of Administration was Colonel Terence James, and he stated to Robert Todd. Robert Todd was probably the best FOI, Freedom of Information Act researcher in history. He he submitted 5,000 FOIs about UFOs over a 22-year period. NORAD told Bob Todd, quote, "This command has no present activity in investigating UFOs, nor does any area of the United States government that I'm aware of." Now, both statements are absolutely false. NORAD does detect and investigate UFO events, and other areas of the United States government were as well, including the US Air Force and Federal Aviation Administration, as per another letter that went to Robert Todd from, of all places, the US Army in 1976, but I'll get to that later. Another letter from NORAD's Director of Administration said, quote, "We do not undertake investigative measures. Our interests are satisfied in near real time, and no formal documentation is created by this command." That's absolute trash. Enormous amounts of documentation have been released from NORAD from the late 60s through the early 70s. Right at the precise time of writing this letter, Bob Todd was having another colonel at NORAD actually release UFO documents. While one colonel is saying we do not generate any paperwork, no formal documentation is created by us, another person at NORAD was actually sending formal documentation from NORAD headquarters, I think 21st NORAD region in New York, was actually sending Bob Todd NORAD documents. Extraordinary. This is like two hands simply cannot get their story straight. Yet another letter. On April 25th, 1988, there was a reply letter to an oddball British researcher by the name of Armand Victorian. Lieutenant Colonel Roger Pinnell, who was the Chief of Operations Branch in the Directorate of Public Affairs, stated that thank you for your recent letter requesting information on unidentified flying objects. Unfortunately, we have not recently released any information concerning UFOs, nor do we keep any information on file. Although we do not have any information on UFOs, you may wish to write to the following address. The address that this Lieutenant Colonel gave Armand Victorian was actually MUFON. That was the MUFON headquarters, which has got to be the biggest fob off. I mean, that's a complete fob off. So what he's saying here, he was saying that we haven't got any recent documentation on UFOs, and this was in 1988. Well, in 1987, Canada's 1st Air Division and headquarters Air Defence Winnipeg actually was generating formal documentation about UFOs. I mean, another example. I mean. the list just goes on and on and on. There are examples here where NORAD has actually had to stress over UFOs to the point where they've engaged with the National Military Command Center in Washington, D.C. They've had to urgently telex the 8th Air Force or the 15th Air Force, telling them to, who's going to deal with this UFO problem we've currently got over, be it California or whatever. One example is I've got a telex here from 1964, and it says the National Military Command Center and NORAD advised that there were 6 to 12 unidentified flying objects at 30 miles east of Merced, California. Radar picked up 12 objects at altitude of 60,000 to 90,000 feet and higher elevations. F-106 aircraft were scrambled at Castle Air Force Base. There were no results because of the high altitudes. They are checking the possibility of sending U-2s. Now, further, there was an update to that message. It's a telex message, and it says objects were following a 60-mile racetrack pattern. F-106s were flying.
Okay, can you run that by me? What, a racetrack pattern?
That's the thing. That's when you go around in a big, like a big oblong shape. I think it's where you go around it in kind of like a lozenge shape.
Understood. And 90,000 feet, that's virtually to the limits of the atmosphere.
Incredible. Here's one. And then it says pilots locked onto some of the objects but could not keep the lock. Then it says NORAD said they were sending 2 more aircraft with pilots in pressure suits. So this is a rather extraordinary document. While on one hand, at the time, the United States Air Force was running Project Blue Book, and NORAD were always kept out of the discussion. Congressmen and senators and adjunct generals and inspector generals and whatever would formally ask Blue Book for latest information, latest statistics, latest best cases, latest worst cases, whatever, and never ever was NORAD discussed. It's always someone else but NORAD. It's always overseas embassies generating UFO reports. It's always civilian sightings by hyperactive housewives. It's always someone else's fault. It's never NORAD. Well, so that's why this topic is so important. And like I said, we have actually managed to get some impressive information out. There were clues all along, and this is really interesting. Back in 1968, in July, some listeners may remember that the US House Committee on Science and Astronautics held a somewhat, well, at the time, famous hearing, which it was called the Symposium on Unidentified Flying Objects, and it was several months before the end of Project Blue Book was going on, and the famous UFO study team Condon report was released about UFOs.
That's the one that Gerald Ford pretty much jump-started out of the Michigan case.
Yeah. He was part of. Yes, that was instrumental in these these hearings, this symposium on unidentified flying objects. Ford was actually, I don't know if you'd say instrumental, but it certainly gave it legs. It was like I think someone called Gerald Ford's work a shot in the arm. But anyway. The discussions on like buried deep within these hearings, like well into the boring part of the day, the discussions were actually quite illuminating about military tracking of space objects and possibly UFOs, and something was said that during his speech, Dr. Robert M. Baker, who was a scientist. He was somewhat of a pro-UFO scientist. He said something very impressive. Now this is, you've got to remember, this is right back in 1968. He said in dealing with the subject of space tracking, missile detection, and anomalous phenomena, he made this astonishing statement. He said, "There is only one surveillance system known to me that exhibits sufficient continuous coverage to have even the slight opportunity of betraying the presence of anomalistic phenomena operating above the Earth's atmosphere. The system is partially classified, and hence I cannot go into detail about it during an unclassified meeting. I can, however, state that yesterday I travelled to Colorado Springs and confirmed that since this particular sensor system has been in operation, there have been a number of anomalistic alarms that, as of this date, have not been explained on the basis of natural phenomena, interference, equipment malfunction or inadequacy, or man-made space objects. Now, what's interesting, that's what he actually said. No one took any notice of it. Unbelievable. Dr. Baker mentioned Colorado Springs, and that is without a doubt a reference to
That's
NORAD.
That's Cheyenne Mountain.
Cheyenne Mountain. Well, back then, yeah. Now Cheyenne Mountain is simply an air station that's on backup warm alert. But yeah, it's so even in the 1960s, NORAD's ability. Now I've talked about NORAD often. Well, detecting things in the atmosphere. NORAD in the 60s and to a lesser extent in the 70s, they had the role of tracking things in space. It's not like that now, which I'll discuss later. But even the Deputy Secretary of Defense, who was James Douglas in 1960, which is a very long time ago, said he made a statement saying, "We have embarked on studies to inspect satellites at close range in the interests of our own satellite operations." In other words, US decision makers had agreed that defence satellites in the future could be designed to study foreign spacecraft, and that was something that a few ufologists were actually very impressed by, because imagine having the ability as way back as the 60s to actually sneak up under the command of the Space Operations Centre, to actually sneak up on another satellite and look what was going on,
sure.
right next to it.
Yeah, I mean, we were doing that kind of thing with the Gemini program, rendezvousing with the, I think it was the Gina that they would do, and rendezvous. So they were working on this and looking to make it happen.
Yeah, it's so one thing that is very, it can sometimes be frustrating for me, is that there is a misconception. So NORAD and its US Air Force squadron and wing counterparts are responsible for, and Canadian Force and Navy counterparts are responsible for what we call in-atmosphere or air breathing or atmospheric detection, validation and warning. So that's planes, missiles, like cruise missiles, hijacked planes, stray aircraft, the odd helicopter, whatever. Most people at face value think that NORAD is also entirely, or at least mostly, responsible for space surveillance, right out to to where the really far satellites go. Most people think that NORAD is responsible for space warning, missile warning, like missile impact warning, meteorite debris impact warning, the monitoring of friendly and not so friendly spacecraft, new foreign launch warning. So the fact of the matter is, now in the 2010s, it's just not the case. NORAD is simply now a customer of space tracking, space detection information. The primary, and this is where we're be very careful, my colleagues and I, with freedom of information requests and general correspondence with your government, is that the actual folk who are responsible for what goes on in space is actually primarily overall is actually US Stratcom, which is US Strategic Command, which is based at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. And US Strategic Command is made up of the space component commands from the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. So that's Army Strategic Missile Defense Command, Navy Space Command, and Air Force Space Command. And of those components, it is mostly Air Force Space Command who is dedicated to monitoring what goes on in space, detecting new objects, updating orbital catalogues, sending impact and attack warnings to NORAD or the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the Canadian Parliament. And this is really important, because people say, well, who actually watches, like literally watches what goes on in space? Like, where are the cameras? Where are the radars? And right now, it is the 21st Space Wing, which is operational under Air Force Space Command headquarters. The 21st Space Wing has a group called the 21st Operations Group, and within the 21st Operations Group, the 18th Space Control Squadron at Vandenberg in California is responsible for tracking everything in orbit, and it receives its information from a bunch of space surveillance network sites, which are run by the 20th Space Control Squadron. They are the telescopes that are in Diego Garcia, in Hawaii, in Spain, in England, plus a bunch of long-range radar sites that are dedicated to incoming missile warning. And so those squadrons and those detachments use radar and telescopes to monitor countries that are launching new missile systems, whatever. And that's where we think at the absolute coalface, some very unusual events, on the edge of space or actually up into space may have occurred. We know where the data goes. We even know how it goes. We know where it's stored. It's stored at a place called the Joint Space Operations Center in Vandenberg, who are tasked. It's a center that's run by the Joint Functional Component Center for Space under Air Force Space Command, which are in turn under US Stratcom, and that's precisely where we need to go for space object identification, space verification data, space surveillance information, object identification or misidentification or unidentification. And that the problem is that time and time again, ever since actually 1996, researchers have been specifically told that uncorrelated target information from space is classified at minimum secret. So we've seen it in policy manuals and instruction manuals, but US Stratcom and its subordinates keeping all space object information at minimum at the secret level. So it just will not be declassified. We've tried every single angle. We've even tried to approach the Americans through Britain. That's like desperate to do that, but we've even tried the Ministry of Defence's UK space. I think it's called the UK Space Activity Centre, who they get a direct feed from America's Joint Functional Component Center for Space. So we even tried to hoodwink by going in that direction, and it wasn't going to work. So it's pretty fascinating stuff. But all of this is overlooked. I mean, most researchers are running around on Facebook talking about Bigelow and AATIP and NIDS and Skinwalker Ranch and dabbling in gemstones and Eastern religion, and then the real culprits, if UFOs do exist, the real culprits are back at Peterson Air Force Base in Vandenberg in California. So there you go.
These organizations have the gear. They've got the gear to capture the physical evidence of UFOs or whatever they turn out to be, but they've got the gear to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really what it comes down to. I don't have a radar set in my backyard. I'm working on getting a refurbished one on eBay, but I got to get my tax return before I can afford it. And
Yeah, it's just like we've even found we've actually even found a manual that is used, that used to be used at Cheyenne Mountain in the 80s. It was a manual where it was a manual that discussed who would be pulled on board in case of a really weird space detection, and it's called the operations loop. And the people that were involved in the operations loop were the NORAD command director, all the NORAD senior directors at sector level, like all around the country and into Canada, and they would get on something. They would get on a classified phone system. It's called the Red Warning, and there was only 5 items that could be discussed between these particular battle space commanders and space surveillance operations people. There was only 6 objects that could things that could be discussed. One of them was unknown radar activity, and another one was space object maneuvering. So you'd like to be in one of those conversations when something odd happened. I don't know.
Yeah. Space object maneuvering, that would be interesting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I know. That's the actual term. That's yeah. It's there's so many there's so many interesting angles to all this. Another organisation that really raised alarm bells for me was back in the 80s. The NORAD was joined at the hip with something. It's funny with all this Trump Space Force business because we've actually already had one. Back from 1980, I think it was 1980 to 2002, the U.S. Space Command existed. It was a unified combatant command, 26,000 staff underneath it. US Space Command was based literally next to NORAD, same buildings, same centre, same land. US Space Command, it's a bit like Stratcom today. It was made up of Army Space Command, Air Force Space Command, and Navy Space Command, and it was a centralised super center for everything from space rocket launching through to, aiding foreign countries with their space launching, through to protecting satellites from early computer virus uploads, through to working alongside NASA in emergencies. Everything. U.S. Space Command, it was a huge unified combatant command, and within US Space Command and NORAD, there was a joint directorate. There was a joint organisation that answered both directly to the Commander-in-Chief of NORAD and the Commander-in-Chief of Space Command, and it was called the Directorate of Aerospace Analysis. And apparently it had about 60 staff in the 80s, and in the 90s the name was changed actually to the Centre for Aerospace Analysis. The reason this centre is important is I found out through an old NORAD / US Space Command policy document. I found that that there was a statement, that there was a whole chapter on unknown tracks. So when NORAD's radars, when their long-range track while scan and height finding radars pick up something that they can't, it's not communicating on radio. It's they're watching it on the screens. It's something coming towards the United States or leaving at a very rapid pace or something that shouldn't be there. It's on the screens. It's literally called an unknown track, or UNK or UNKT, UT, whatever. Each screen's a bit different, I think, but it's called an unknown track. And what's important is that any unknown track that stays unknown for more than 5 minutes and is not resolved, it's called a NORAD remaining unknown. It means that something was definitely up there. It didn't appear to land. We can't arrest the pilot. We don't know where it went. It was really strange. Anyway, I've got a document, like I was saying, it's a NORAD Space Command joint publication, and it says in section 11.1, it says the Air Defence Operations Centre sends a copy of these reports to the Centre for Aerospace Analysis, and I thought, I've seen this Centre for Aerospace Analysis before, and so I pulled up an old letter that was sent to a British researcher called Armand Victorian, and this old letter admitted that the Centre for Aerospace Analysis did do analysis and investigative work on unknown tracks and NORAD remaining unknown tracks. And that was, so I've got sort of like double confirmation, because you can't just go off one old document, like all the time. It's really good if you can have some backup. I think the actual wording that was sent to Armand Victorian, I've just pulled it up in front of me. It says the Aerospace Analysis Directorate does perform analysis on NORAD unknown track reports. They perform their analysis under the auspices of the NORAD role using a dedicated NORAD database. So here we've got a discussion saying that weird unknown radar hits and detections using NORAD radar systems. A study that this Directorate for Aerospace Analysis and later Centre for Aerospace Analysis, finally one final document from 2004, which I haven't written about yet, and I've got to do this. I found that in 2004, the House Committee on Government Reform asked NORAD a series of questions relating a bit to September 11 and hijacked aircraft. But in their replies, the NORAD actually said to the to the committee, they said that the Centre for, again, same word, the Centre for Aerospace Analysis performs, investigative work on NORAD remaining unknown tracks, which have, puzzled operation staff, whatever it says, and that is that. So this organisation has been around since at least 1987, and it was still current as of 2004. So if they're performing analysis and investigative and exploratory work on the weirdest unknown radar detections across North America, this is something of paramount importance. But talking to them directly is impossible because they're underneath NORAD's headquarters, and they by law they're exempt from the Freedom of Information Act, and everything would be classified at least secret. So that's another barrier to significant investigations.
Got it. Now you also mentioned that they also acquire information from the Federal Aviation Administration, and can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, that was an interesting one. So I discovered I was looking in an old Federal Aviation Administration order, which is kind of like a huge book. An order, this particular order, I think, was running at 600 pages or something, and the Federal Aviation Administration, they have excellent secondary surveillance radar and primary radar coverage, obviously around airports, and also between major airports. They have these massive en route centres which monitor aircraft flying high in the sky. And the Federal Aviation Administration radar feed or radar data is shared with NORAD. So where NORAD and the US Air Force counterparts, where they do not have radar coverage, because the US Air Force and NORAD can't literally have radar coverage absolutely everywhere. They're primarily for attack and warning, and for drug runners, and for hijack aircraft, and attack warning from the direction of, I suppose, Russia, and missile warning. So to have, say, NORAD and US Air Force live radar streams from, say, the middle of Kentucky would seem a bit. So the FAA has plugged those holes, and I found an interesting document. And what it showed was it was if there's a situation where the FAA has aided the tracking of the tracking of an unexpected or unknown aircraft, object, whatever, and let's say the FAA share that data with NORAD. NORAD will then command or ask a US Air Force jet or pair of jets to go and chase that object. And at the on the FAA side, so now we've got three distinct, I suppose, organisations watching or at least concerned about an unknown object. We've got NORAD, who's vectoring in aircraft. We've got the US Air Force, who are actually operating the aircraft and piloting them, and we've got the FAA, who is monitoring the whole situation primarily from the point for the purpose of air safety for civilian airlines and so on.
Yeah, if you don't mind, let me jump in here really quick. A lot of folks at home, I'm sure, are familiar with air traffic controllers and what they do. Basically, when they're looking at that screen, what they're looking at is merged data, where they're getting a feed from radar, and it can vary depending on what part of the country they're in terms of who owns the radar installation. But they're getting merged data, the radar, and then they're also getting the transponder information. So they know the flight numbers and so on of who's up in the air. Now the reason I happen to know a little bit about this relates to the Japan airline case, where what Bruce Maccabee and Ron Pandolfi were able to do was get the video screen, basically a videotape of the air traffic controller's screen. And what that was the merged data from the obviously the transponder information and all that. but also the radar, and the radar up in Alaska,
radar,
up in the middle of nowhere, was owned by the Air Force. So I just wanted to throw that in there, just to impress people that I know a little bit about what I'm talking about.
Yeah, that's a classic. That is a classic example. Elmendorf Primary Radar, U.S. Air Force, and the Alaska FAA Air Region transponder SSR radar was merged. You can merge it both on repeat. You can merge it in the form of printouts, like target printouts. But yeah, so I was studying the FAA in its relationship to, helping NORAD and the US Air Force vector in aircraft into, like, encircling or visually, inspecting an unknown object. And I found something. Turns out that FAA air traffic controllers, when apparently this happens, when the FAA are part of the process of helping the US Air Force and NORAD chase down a pesky balloon or UFO or whatever, right? The FAA controllers have to fill out a form, and there's actually two sections to it. Depending on what happens in the sky, there's two sections. Either they fill out Part A or they fill out Part B, and Part A is called aircraft identification before intercept. And what that means is that if the US Air Force identified the object, or if someone identified what the object was before our planes got there, like through a Mayday signal, an SOS, the aircraft crashed in the sea, whatever. If the object or aircraft is identified well before the US Air Force actually get there to stare at it, they fill out Part A, and if, though, the aircraft or the object is identified after intercept occurs, that means, so the US Air Force get there, they radio back to the FAA and NORAD and say, oh crap, this is just another balloon, or it's a research balloon, or it's a remote control drone that's obviously stray or whatever. Then the FAA controllers fill out Part B, and that's called a unknown intercept log, Part B. And so it occurred to me that over the years, I suppose that FAA air traffic controllers have probably filled out a lot of these forms. So I'd be curious to see. I'd be curious to see the after intercept forms. I mean, most times I'm sure that the after intercept forms will simply, there'll be piles of them that simply say, US Air Force jets got there, we found it was a balloon as we suspected, blah blah blah. But I'd be curious to see what all of them. I mean, imagine if we found a situation where an air traffic controller at the FAA had written US Air Force jets under our control and with NORAD identified the object as a football-shaped glowing metallic disc, whatever. Now that would be interesting. And these forms apparently I read are actually kept for a long time. They're kept because for statistical and safety reasons. So that's another I suppose angle for FOI requests. Yeah.
Now, you also wanted to discuss NASIC, and that might be an acronym that a lot of folks are not familiar with. So why don't you run through that a little bit?
Yeah, that was I guess a lot of listeners will remember that that the US Air Force originally, after Project Sign and Project Grudge, which were early UFO case collection and investigative efforts by the Directorate of Air Force Intelligence and Air Force Material Command, or Air Material Command back then, that people will know that for 20 years until 1969, that Project Blue Book was the 20-year ongoing study, investigative study, case collection, case collation, public affairs shambles at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. In the early days, Blue Book was actually operated as, it was one of 90 projects within the Air Technical Intelligence Centre's area. Air Technical Intelligence Centre actually, in I think 1961, changed its name to FTD, the Foreign Technology Division, and Foreign Technology Division was tasked or functional under Air Force Systems Command. Anyway, the Foreign Technology Division, or FTD, was they existed for about 30 years until they got a whole pile of name changes. The FTD, or Foreign Technology Division, they've always been at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
And they go back. They can draw their lineage all the way back to World War I. This is not a new organization.
Yes, yeah. The Army, the Army. There was an Army engineering sector that traces that if you go right back, yeah. And but in the late 80s, the FTD was all of a sudden the Air Force. It was suddenly the AFFTD Class C, which was the Foreign Aerospace Science and Technology Centre. Then it was NAIC, the National Air Intelligence Centre. And in about 15 years ago, the name changed, and we've still got it. It's now the National Air and Space Intelligence Centre, or NASIC. And where this is important is that NASIC's whole job, like their primary mission, is to work with foreign, to study and investigate and analyze and replicate everything from foreign missile systems to foreign rocket systems, to studying everything from the fuel requirements of foreign aircraft to the aerial cyber attack capabilities of foreign aircraft, to the progress of satellite development within third world countries or rogue states or whatever. NASIC are vital in keeping America at the absolute forefront of air and aerospace and space capability. So it would be of no surprise to me. I mean, even in the 80s, like basically Project Blue Book wound up at the end of 1969, and with that, the Foreign Technology Division, the Foreign Technology Division apparently washed their hands of the UFO topic. Well, since then, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, there has been numerous examples where the Foreign Technology Division, whether it be the Flight Services Squadron or one of the disruptive technology missions or whatever, have come up in UFO lore. So an example would be 1989. In 1989, so going back to NORAD for a second, NORAD and the Air Force Space Command, occasionally using something called the DSP satellite system, occasionally the DSP satellite system, whose job it is to detect nuclear launch, like nuclear missile launches and detonations on the Earth's surface. The DSP space mission would occasionally pick up these things called fast walkers, and fast walkers, if you believe what is written about them, which is probably true, their fast walkers are simply foreign or unknown or unexpected satellite or other spacecraft that get in the field of view of a DSP satellite and reflect a lot of sunlight. So say you've got a DSP satellite looking down on Earth, a new Chinese weather satellite.
Sorry to interrupt, but DSP, can you clear that up?
Support program. Defense Support Program satellite operated by Buckley Air Force Base, Buckley Air Force Base, and I think Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. They're just these I suppose constellation of satellites that look down on Earth's surface, waiting for nuclear blasts. Well, they're light detectors. They're called bangometers. Their light detectors are so sensitive that they'll even pick up forest fires and oil well explosions and fireworks factory explosions and whatever. Anyway, sometimes, if a foreign satellite zooms past the field of view for a couple of minutes, that data will. The object is called a fast walker, and fast walker data is handled by NORAD and the space and the Air Force Space Command's operations center. Anyway, so like I was saying before, the NASIC, or the old Foreign Technology Division, you wouldn't think that the Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base would be would be so. Look, their job in unknown object detection and tracking has long gone, apparently. But it turns out that fast walker data, so direction of strange object in space, light reflectivity of strange object in space, what made our systems pick it up and not others, whatever, because fast walkers have been linked to the UFO phenomena. Those who do not believe that fast walkers are just foreign satellites we'll call them UFOs, our sort of UFOs. Anyway, I was quite surprised because it turns out that fast walker data is actually analysed by the Foreign Technology Division. And one, for instance, Jeffrey T. Richardson's famed book, America's Space Sentinels, The History of the DSP Satellite System. Jeffrey T. Richardson was a non-fiction author who studied US intelligence, space surveillance, etc. He wrote, after interviewing someone who he wouldn't name, someone obviously at Space Command or NORAD, Jeffrey Richardson wrote in his book, his 1999 book, he wrote, quote, "Most fast walkers have been routine observations of foreign spacecraft. The infrared readings obtained by DSP satellites resulting from the reflection of sunlight off spacecraft provide analysts at the CIA, DIA, and Air Force Foreign Technology Division, which is now the National Air Intelligence Center, with data on spacecraft signatures and movements." Now, that's interesting because we've essentially got a UFO situation in space being picked up by our early warning satellites, the DSP system, right? And fast walker data, this data, like this actual raw data, is being sent to the CIA of all places, the DIA, and the Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. What's also interesting is that if you read Richardson's actual words, he says most fast walkers have been routine observations of foreign spacecraft. What's most mean? Most, is that 50%, 51%? Is that a 99%? Jeffrey T. Richardson was very well connected. He was talking to people at everywhere from Maritime Command in Canada through to the missile warning squadrons up at Cape Cod and wherever. And so he's written. I implicitly trust what he says, and he's saying most fast walkers have been detected. And the other point is, of course, is that this information was going to Air Force Foreign Technology Division. So there's just one simple example of where the UFO sort of connection may be there with NASIC. The current, another example is there was a thesis written but for the Air Force Institute of Technology in 1989 by Captain I can't even pronounce his name. I suppose it's Ozak. And the thesis was called "Orbit Determination of Sunlight Illuminated Objects Detected by Overhead Platforms." How's that? And he writes that the North American Aerospace Defense Command tasked the Foreign Technology Division's Flight Performance Division to analyse these 15 to 30-minute data tracks and determine their element set and hopefully identifying the object. Okay, so again,
do you know what Paul? Do you know what that means by element set?
Element set means like each object in space that's not random. Like, so something that passes Earth is a bit random, like a meteorite or whatever, or a rock in space. Or something we can't track for longer than a few seconds, whatever. But an element set, anything that's going round and round the Earth in an orbit, has something called an element set, and I think it's like for want of a better word, a six-dimensional, which can't exist, but I think it's called like a six-dimensional display of data. So it's a version of space azimuth bearing heading. Like it relies on like Kepler's law and Newton's law and whatever. It's a bunch of information that tells us where an object should be, how fast it's going, what its escape velocity should be, if it could get away from Earth, how Earth's gravity is pulling it down, that sort of thing. It's and so here we've got a situation where I don't know. And another example that's important is the Foreign Technology Division, which, as I was saying, is now NASIC. they were sucking in UFO information in the early 80s. There was actually a raft of UFO sightings in northwest China in 1982, look, I think that they were probably missile launches that had failed. They'd gone wrong, but because that's just what they look like. The descriptions of the actual UFOs, the UFO going around in circles with no apparent direction, whatever. Anyway, the Foreign Technology Division was suckling in newspaper articles, magazine articles, and so on. One was a Chinese. It was like a Chinese paper called "First UFO Incident for Our Country," and the Foreign Technology Division translated it and held it as a document for reference. There was another one called the UFO Incident of July 24, 1981, a discussion with Comrade Zhang Zhuang, and that was found in a Taiwanese newspaper, and that was also kept by the Foreign Technology Division, and those were released under the Freedom of Information Act way back in I think the mid 80s, and we just wonder how many more there were. I mean, I would be very curious to see, even if the Foreign Technology Division, or now NASIC, are not actually doing work in any way on the UFO topic, I'd be still curious to see what resources they've actually kept over the years. I'd be curious to see, what you might find in internal emails. Is anyone there interested in the UFO topic? Yeah, so it's definitely pause for thought.
Okay, I had a question for you. I don't know if you can hear me, Paul, but the question I had for you is about black helicopters. We actually had your colleague Keith Basterfield on 3 weeks ago. That was a fabulous interview also.
Yep.
And I asked him whether he had ever had any research that came up with black helicopters, also known as phantom helicopters. They take their names from the fact that they're completely black in color and they lack any and all identifying markings. And they've turned up in alien abduction cases and cattle mutilation events and in late night UFO encounters. People have reported this stuff since the 60s. By the way, I just read that from mysteriousuniverse.org. But I've run across this kind of story around the world when I've done my own research regarding these kind of topics. And people I've actually spoke to who said that they've seen black helicopters themselves. Who these people know what helicopters look like. I mean, they don't have to be pilots to know that they don't have any identifying marks, and they look very strange, and they seem to be hovering over areas that don't seem appropriate for the helicopters to be in. And they also, yes, are known, whether it be myth or fact, that they are spotted in areas where alleged abductions have taken place. And when we asked Keith about it, he said no. Regarding Australia, he has had nothing that has come up regarding black helicopters. Why do you think that is? Why are there reports around the world about that, but not with regards to Australia?
To answer your question, well, I got some good news and I got some bad. Like Keith, I don't think I've ever heard a single case or report or anecdote or opinion about black helicopters in Australia. I think that even something unreliable, it's just literally like a third-hand story. I don't even think I've heard that. The closest thing would be that there's I think there's been a few random UFO sightings in Australia where helicopters have happened to be there later, and whether they be black or unidentifiable or phantom helicopters, don't know. Could be search and rescue helicopters, could be just a coincidence. I actually do not know. I know, and the other thing is I don't know enough about the topic anymore, I would say, to sort of be able to answer why it would occur in one part of the world and not others, other than, I mean, the logical example is that black helicopters or mystery or phantom helicopters are being operated by some sort of shadow or face government or quasi-government organisation or whatever. I don't know. Well, the good news is this. I speak to every single day, almost every single day. I speak to the author of a book that brought black helicopters or mystery helicopters to the attention of the American public. And that author is a guy called Barry Greenwood. He's based in Boston. In the early 80s or the late 70s, there was a number of, or there is or was a number of researchers in the United States which started absolutely pummeling the US military and intelligence community with freedom of information requests, usually with great success. Many of those freedom of information requests made it into newsletters and one famed book, which I'll discuss in a minute, and many of the results of those FOI requests literally still languish in drawers and filing cabinets to this day, and we're just starting to see them now. And some of the contents of them are just unbelievable, and that's why I write my blog, to try and get this stuff out. But anyway, in the 70s, Barry Greenwood, Brad Sparks, Lawrence Fawcett, Todd Zeckel, and particularly Robert Todd were successfully submitting submitting FOI requests, engaging in appeals, a bunch of lawsuits even, and actually ultimately getting UFO documents out. By 1983, those guys that I just mentioned had 5,000 pages of UFO records that dated from after the end of Project Blue Book had finished. So the US government at military and intelligence level, particularly at sort of with NORAD and the 8th Air Force and the FAA and so on, had been generating huge amounts of UFO, analysing reports, developing policy, whatever. Anyway, Barry teamed up with a researcher called by the name of Lawrence Fawcett, and so basically Lawrence Fawcett and Barry Greenwood and Robert Todd had so much documentation pouring in from government agencies, much of which, like I said, has still never been published. Anyway, they decided they couldn't handle this. They could literally not keep up. But see, back then there was no internet, no blogs, even long distance phone calls couldn't do, too expensive. And so what Lawrence Fawcett and Barry Greenwood decided to do was actually write a book. And they wrote a book, and it's called the original version of it was called Clear Intent, and it was published in 1984. It was republished in the 90s as the UFO cover-up, What the Government Will Not Say. But anyway, the original book was Clear Intent. And in there, page after page after page after page of detailed reports from sheriffs and from aviation people, farmers, highway patrol people, right down to Indian reservations and everything, of these mysterious black helicopters, particularly peaking in 1973, 74, particularly 1975, dwindling off in 1976. Now, when writing this book, Barry Greenwood took on certain tasks, and Lawrence Fawcett took on other tasks. Lawrence Fawcett, unfortunately, is deceased. He was the guy, as the pair went. He was the guy that did the work, did the analysis work, and the obtaining of reports about these black helicopters. Barry was more inclined to write about or pick and choose what to put in the book in regards to government documents and what to believe and who not to believe and so on. But so. A really, really, really good reference if you want to go right back to early 1970s era black helicopter or phantom helicopter reports and response to those reports. The head scratching, the phone calls, the alerts at military bases, the way tabloid articles treated the phenomena in the 70s. Clear Intent is a fantastic resource, and the good thing is Barry has kept everything. So. If anyone was, Chant, if you were curious, I suppose, about black helicopters, Barry and some of the rest of us have fantastic early information, handwritten letters, even Christmas cards mentioning them, draft copies of books, whatever. So, but to answer your question, I don't know. I just don't know enough about it anymore. I used to look at it a bit. there was mysterious helicopter sightings actually in Vietnam, to the point where, of course, during the Vietnam War, you were always going to have mysterious helicopters. You are going to have unmarked helicopters operated by the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese, or maybe the Chinese Army Air Forces, ground forces. You're going to have black helicopters doing search and rescue for commandos, or you're going to have CIA black helicopters, whatever. But some of the very quite detailed reports from the Vietnam War, from the 4th Mechanized Infantry or the 3rd Marine, Third Marine Corps, whatever. Some of these reports of these mysterious helicopters go even beyond that level of weirdness. Helicopters that for all intents and purposes simply should not be in a certain place in a certain time, or helicopters that the American ground forces would actually blast with howitzers and machine gun fire. These helicopters would be seen to land. The landing site, where in a valley or something, would be blasted from miles away by howitzer fire with direct and successful hits. And then the servicemen would go down there in platoons and find that the ground was all burnt, but there was nothing there. No dead helicopter, no smashed up helicopter. And that's odd. We've got piles of this sort of paperwork. It's really, really old. It's really mysterious. Unfortunately, though, it's very old. It's very hard to talk to people when the event occurred 55 years ago or something. And yeah, so there you go.
Right. Thank you very much for having covered that. I just want to let our listeners know that there's a UK UFO researcher by the name of Tony Dodd, the late Tony Dodd. He would actually claim that these helicopters were carrying possibly top secret response teams whose job was it to recover downed UFOs and or evidence of cattle mutilation. And it might even be possible, according to Dodd, regarding his research, that they would even retrieve and cover up evidence of human cattle mutilation. Moving along, regarding the black helicopter topic, just also wanted to mention that there might be shape-shifting alien technology regarding that, and it's not really spoken much about in that manner, but the UFO and well-known researcher and author Nick Redfern claimed to have had collected over 20 cases and witness reports stating exactly that kind of topic regarding possible black helicopters shape-shifting. And there was even MUFON reports regarding strange black helicopter events that were reported to them. So it's just a really interesting topic. Moving along, I wanted to ask you, Paul, about field reports from cases like the Nimitz case, for example. Where do you think those field reports go?
Yeah, I mean, Paul, just to jump in here, we get these anecdotes from credible sources who were on the ship saying, this Nimitz case happened, that they had an Air Force guy and maybe some plainclothes guys as well. I can't recall, but at least an Air Force guy on the ship very shortly thereafter, picking up data bricks and taking them somewhere. Do you have any idea where that somewhere might be?
Yeah, I guess I could probably think of a chronological list that, okay, in that particular case happened on the West Coast. So, yeah, I suppose somewhat logically, Vandenberg Air Force Base has an incredible ability, or an incredible, I suppose, incredible resources. Computers, supercomputers, technical people, scientists, boffins with glasses. Vandenberg is at the forefront of object detection in space. They are at the forefront of safety, of air safety and space launch safety. I could not think of, certainly on the West Coast, that and Los Angeles Air Force Base, but on the West Coast, somewhere like either Vandenberg or Edwards, anywhere with extraordinary technical capability, that there's, look, I don't know, that there's one organisation called the 84th Radar Evaluation Squadron. They're actually based on the other side of the country in Langley, Virginia, and 84th Radar Evaluation Squadron, their job is to analyse. Analyze radar data for safety and statistical purposes, for training and evaluation. So that would, as far as radar data goes, the 84th Radar Evaluation Squadron in Virginia, or I think it used to be at Hill Air Force Base in Utah, and I think now it's in Virginia. But anyway, they would be very, very good. Probably the most likely place I would have thought would be for say the Nimitz case event. I would have thought would be probably the best case, if not Vandenberg or Edwards. I would have thought NASIC that I was talking about before, because NASIC's job is to understand. I mean, for all we know, the Nimitz event. I mean, just straight after it happened, if U.S. Air Force non-commissioned officers or warrant, officers, whatever, if they did get to the ship, and if they did request and hijack, radar tapes, hard drives, copies of visual footage, voice recordings from plane to plane, voice recordings from plane to ship, whatever. If they commandeered this stuff and squirreled it away, I would have thought maybe multiple places if they can make copies of everything, but one place definitely would be NASIC. I mean, NASIC's job at squadron and group level, their mission is to understand foreign or unexpected technology. Their mission is to understand disruptive technology or game-changing technology that goes out decades. They certainly have the ability in things like metallurgy and flight dynamics and aeronautics. If you look at NASIC's, if you look at people that work at NASIC, I've even done this. You go to LinkedIn and you type in NASIC, and aside from all the the IT people and the payroll people and the administrative people and right down to like waste disposal people, aside from them, forget them. The people that actually work there are everyone from flight dynamicists to aeronautical experts and astrodynamicists, various people within the physical sciences like atmospheric physics, metallurgy, cutting edge electrical and electromagnetic sciences, whatever. That would be the place to take data. I reckon.
Okay, yeah, I have a question for you, Paulding. Thank you so much for having covered that topic. I wanted to know if you ever have come across even any anecdotal reports regarding Men in Black, also the black-eyed children. That's a topic that's covered often in ufology, and there's people from all around the world who don't even know each other, who have stories to tell with regards to Men in Black, who have a very strange aura about them. The reports they vary, but the idea is the same. A report, an example might be that a black-eyed Men in Black might be wearing a seemingly all-new suit, and they appear from out of nowhere with a black Cadillac that appears to be new from like the 50s or the 60s, and they come to harass witnesses to a UFO event. And they have very strange behavior about them. They seem very aggressive. They act strange. They ask strange questions, and then they also seemingly disappear too, just as oddly as they showed up. Regarding the black-eyed children, the black-eyed kids, they also have strange stories of folks who are all around the world, don't even know each other, mentioning that there's kids that show up out of nowhere, trying to mesmerize them or hypnotize them into getting folks to succumb to their wishes. And then later on, folks describe strange events that occur to them that are, bad luck, divorces, financial ruin, things like that. Have you come across any stories like that you've collected over the many years of research that you've done?
I haven't. I certainly would have books on these topics. I do know about them, of course. I mean, they're in UFO lore. They're Men in Black, the black-eyed children thing. Now that is so far from what I do that's not funny. But the Men in Black lore, or I mean, it just distracts me from NORAD and Vietnam War and whatever. But the Men in Black phenomena it's been reported with some degree of reliability for a very long time. I don't even know when it started. I mean, that's the work of John Keel, discussed it early on. Even Richard Hall, the great researcher, was open to the possibility. Look,
this goes back to the Forrestal days.
Yeah,
the Men in Black.
Yeah, it's pretty old.
And Maury Island.
I've never encountered it in Australia. I've never heard. I mean, yes, we've had reports, and they're really quite unreliable. Or totally, utterly unstamped.
We do get these stories, and I think a lot of the witnesses, especially in the Nimitz case, but some others that are a lot more reliable. Something happens. Somebody shows up from somewhere. People are debriefed. Evidence is accumulated and taken away. Those are pretty common and a lot more credible, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, I would. Yeah, of course. I mean, if you just look, I do know one thing I can tell you is that some listeners will remember that there was a very influential civilian hobbyist, whatever, UFO group in the 60s mostly. It was very, very famed in the 60s into the 70s called NICAP, which is National Investigative Committee for Aerial Phenomena. It was a civilian UFO group, had a huge number of members, generated a lot of excellent paperwork. They analysed UFO photographs and they had symposiums and whatever. Well, I do know that some NICAP, whatever, I'll say NICAP, some NICAP members, that did UFO field investigation, have over the years been reported to be rather overzealous, and I believe there was cases where NICAP volunteers who were investigating local UFO cases or whatever were a little overzealous and would go to people's homes and in nice suits and pretend to be all authoritative and not discuss where they're from very without a lot of probing and so on, and this could intimidate people. I don't know. I mean, I suppose I'm saying is that there certainly will be a few examples in American history where completely innocuous real people just happen to be in black suits and ties in a black car have rocked up to have a look at people's photographs or to interrogate their children about a UFO they saw last week or whatever. But I mean, of course, I know that the stories are a lot richer than that, in that, the claims have been consistently made that MIBs, they rock up very quickly. They ring the house first before they get there and just hang up. They're in a brand new car, that's not wet, even though it's pouring, raining somehow, or the ground's, they've been driven up a dirt road or something. There's not a speck of dirt on the car. I've heard that one. I don't know. I just don't know enough about it. It's too hard to quantify. Other than the report from the witnesses themselves, other from the family who say, look, we've got to tell this story. 3 months ago, we saw a UFO, and then these men in black appeared. I mean, that's all you've got to go on. Like, you don't have more to go on that. You don't have data, like actual instrumented data. You don't have a chronology, like a witness statement of these men in black immediately after they left the house. You don't have any idea where they're supposedly from. There's a dozen theories about where they came from and where they go. It's like black helicopters. Say they're real, right? Well, where do they go? Where do they refuel? Who's running all these phantom helicopters? Well, what do the pilots tell their wives every night? It just doesn't make sense. Like it's yes, there is probably something to it. It's very hard to investigate, is what I'm trying to say. Certainly not my area.
Yeah,
well, certainly, as far as the military cases, as a civilian, you're not going to bluff your way onto an Air Force base and find out what the pilot saw in his UFO.
Oh, no,
case.
Totally agree. That's a totally different situation.
Yeah, I'm very curious as to the way you're explaining it. It seems like this data is pretty fragmented. It's all over the place. One hand doesn't seem to know what the other's doing. You think that's the case, or do you think it all does end up somewhere?
No, I've never felt. I've never felt ever that there is one massive, multi-million-dollar, multi-generational repository for every UFO case, event, detection, false alarm, whatever, somewhere hiding in the bowels of NORAD or whatever. We are finding that consistently over the years, and I've got so many examples on paper, that NORAD and the US Air Force and the US Navy do have reporting regulations like OPREP 3 reporting, service reporting, MERENT reporting, HADA reporting. I'm going to go into these in my next blog post, actually. There are so many methods of reporting UFOs, of sequestering information, faxing it or mailing it with urgency by an old naval speed letter in the 60s, or now it's an OPREP 3 formatted serious event message now, or a SITREP Navy Blue message, or whatever. There are so many ways, and yes, some of the final destinations of UFO reports are the Air Force Service Watch Cell, which I'll be discussing in my next blog, the National Military Command Center, their J2 or J3 operations/intelligence area, NASIC, maybe NORAD's old, or we think old Center for Aerospace Analysis, which I talked about before, the FAA's AMOS system. Look, there is multiple places. What I'm more interested in, though, and this is something that is very important, is that if US Air Force officers got on the Nimitz or its support ships, the Princeton, whatever, if they got on there hours or days after the main Tic Tac event, it's not so much the fact that it's, I mean, so of course it is very important to know who they were, where they were from, how they got there, and where they took the information and what they took. That is important. What I'm curious to know is how the US Air Force were even involved in the first place. Did the captain or the deck commander or the vice captain of the ships, did they call the US Air Force in, and through what channels? Through Washington DC, through headquarters, or did they do it directly with a direct communications link to Los Angeles Air Force Base or San Diego Naval Air Station or whatever? Was it a case that the US Air Force were listening in on the pilot-to-pilot and pilot-to-ship communications during the event, and they were so curious that they simply had to get on that ship and sequester copies of the data? Was it a case that there are already US Air Force officers? I mean, I would not be surprised. I mean, let's face it, the US Navy is operating planes, the same types of planes operated by the US Air Force. It's just one big family. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Nimitz, being a ship of carry 5,000 people, two or three of them representatives like liaison or focal point people, special security officers, technical people from the United States Air Force. Why not? I mean, the United States Air Force has naval. I mean, any United States Air Force base that's on a coastline has Coast Guard and naval people at the base. So why not? I mean, is it not inconceivable that a US Navy ship somewhere in that entire flotilla, all those ships, would not have a single US Air Force officer that either got wind of the Tic Tac event or was actually involved from the very start? Of course that they were going to, of course the US Air Force would know about it in that case. Another one is does the United States Navy in that particular carrier group, do they communicate via satellite, like the actual voice communications and telex data communications, like general correspondence communications through satellite, and someone at Buckley Air Force Base or NORAD alternate headquarters or whatever, someone's listening in the conversation for certain keywords like emergency, alert, nuclear, object, attack, offensive. Any keyword that can be picked up by a supercomputer along the way could alert the right people that something very, very, very troubling is going on off the coast of America. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Paul, thank you very much for having covered that topic. I had a question for you. The equivalent for NORAD in Russia is called the Main Center for Missile Attack Warning. I wanted to know the Main Center for Missile Attack Warning, the NORAD equivalent, which is a Russian equivalent of NORAD. Have you had any research come up about that at all?
No, and I would really, really like to. I know that aerospace and the aerospace warning and control, air sovereignty, like long-range warning and control in Russia, and space verification, space watching in Russia is. I know that I'd forgotten that term and like the name you just gave, and I know in the past it was part of or an adjunct organization of the Soviet, I think it was Soviet Strategic Rocket Forces, or the Russian Strategic Rocket Forces. But all I know is that their space tracking and long-range aerospace tracking capabilities are very impressive. They're not at the level of the United States and Canada. There's no way. The landmass is too enormous. Their weather is absolutely atrocious. Half their radars are only turned on 6 months of the year. I'd say their computers are 5 years behind. But the point is that no, unfortunately, I wish we had correspondence and contact with Russian researchers, if not actual retired Russian military officers themselves. I wish we had correspondence and a working relationship with them. So even if we could just get the odd rumor out, let alone hard data, but no, and that's actually a very good question, and someone will have to tackle that issue one day. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we'll get any information on that because, of course, that would probably be classified. And
yeah, for sure.
But anyway, just want to let everybody know that the main Center for Missile Attack Warning was formed in December of 2009. And since December 2011, it's been a part of the Space Command of the Russian Aerospace Defense Forces, together with facilities such as 821st Main Space Intelligence Center and the 153rd Titov Main Space Testing Center. Wanted to move on to another topic, Paul. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that you may have covered the topic of intelligence before, and that would be intelligence agents. Now, we're going to be wrapping up this show here pretty soon, but I still want to cover this topic a little bit. Wanted to ask you, is it correct to say that you were able to uncover information regarding a possible intelligence or alleged confirmed intelligence agent, Richard Doty, regarding the FOIA request that you made on him many years ago? And my understanding is that you actually uncovered more documents than anybody has ever been able to uncover regarding Doty. Is that correct?
Yes and no. No, I'm not taking the credit for that. No, what happened was Richard Doty. Okay, so some time ago, so as we know, Richard Doty was a non-commissioned officer with he was stationed at various places in squadron security roles and counterintelligence roles, right down to things like apparently doing drink, like, I don't know what you call it in your country, but I think you call it DUI or something. He was even doing drink driving testing on bases. So we're not exactly talking about a polished spook here. Now, Doty, the thing is, Doty was tasked and served with the Office of Air Force Special Investigation, most famously. And it's been actually extremely difficult for anyone to get hold of his service records. He was with the Air Force for 20 years. He was a non-commissioned officer, I think, for 20 years, and he moved around a lot. He was in Germany and everywhere. But what actually happened with that, I do know what you're talking about. Okay, many years ago, a researcher, and this is something that perplexes me, but a researcher by the name of Larry before everyone was concerned about privacy, or more so concerned about privacy that it was stifling and strangulating, that we used to be able to, researchers used to be able to get service records, maybe not medical or health records, but certainly service records, awards given, ceremonies, promotional information, whatever. We were able to get such information on servicemen from actually the National Records and Personnel Center in St. Louis. And they have alternate places you can ask to, like at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas at the Personnel Center and so on. But if you were patient and you gave enough information, if you wrote a letter to St. Louis asking for the service records of a particular officer or non-commissioned officer or otherwise military personnel, they would, with some level of redactions, definitely, they would actually release service records. And anyway, in 1987 or early 1988, I'm not sure which one, researcher Larry Bryant, who it was a good FOI researcher in the 80s. He submitted a Freedom of Information request to the Office of the Secretary of the Air Force for a copy of Richard Doty's service records. Anyway, the Chief of Information Release at the Office of Air Force Special Investigation actually, released to Larry a series of records about Richard Doty, and then Larry also went to the 1606th Air Base Wing at Kirkland Air Force Base to ask for current records while Doty was actually working there. And anyway, so Larry actually got out 33 pages of documents. So the AFOSI service records and the Air Base Wing records of Richard Doty, these 33 pages of service records were given to him. And what perplexes me is Larry Bryant never published them. He didn't put them in a newsletter. He didn't offer them to other researchers, as far as I know. They never made it into a book. And so anyway, they were given over the years, some maybe 10 years ago, those service records were given to an author called Christian Lambright. And the Christian Lambright gave them to me. And I published them on my blog. Like, I asked everyone, and I was really perplexed why no one had done this before. So I published them on my blog. So you could say I was the first person to openly publish them so everyone could, review them, but I wasn't the guy that got them out. No. But it leads me on to one thing, is that now that we can show that so many came out years ago, maybe we can actually have another crack at it and see, maybe Doty himself would like to see his own service records. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Larry Bryant. I just wanted to let everybody know that he's been involved in researching this topic of ufology for 50 or 60 years. He did actually work for the government, and his website is ufoview.tumblr.com, ufoview.tumblr.com. Please go check that out. He is an excellent researcher, just like Paul Dean. He's been a little bit longer than he has, and I did actually call him up to ask him to do an interview. Yeah, and that was probably earlier in the year, but I never did get a call back from him. I think
I know why he's not well, and I don't know if I'm supposed to say that, but he's not well.
Yeah, well, one would imagine so. He's probably getting along in years, and we need to give him credit, because that is one person who is very little known. He's kept under the radar. He hasn't sensationalized his research. And he really should have afforded himself a little bit more credit, because out of everybody I know, aside from yourself, Keith Basterfield, Isaac Coy, many others, but he actually is right up there with yourself regarding having been one of the best researchers of all time in ufology and other phenomena. Regarding Richard Doty, I just wanted to bring to your attention one last thing. If you look him up on the CIA Archives website, you'll see a few pages there regarding him, as far as folks trying to find out more information on him, which has been denied repeatedly. I wanted to read just a little bit about that from the CIA Archives, as far as what kind of response they gave. And that is just a very short amount of information. On December 7, 2007, the Office of Information and Privacy Coordinator received this person's request on Richard Doty. And it says, specifically, you're requesting information on the CIA use of his services for any reason or employment of this individual. And then it goes on to say that the information you're asking for must be denied to you, since it is classified under the provisions of such and such executive order, and so on. And it goes on to cite more sections and why they cannot give that information. And they just refuse to give any information on it. Now, I happen to believe that the reason why folks got more information on Richard Doty when they did is because they asked at a much earlier time than 2007. So that's key, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm actually quite impressed that you know about that. The CIA indeed, I know the researcher who actually submitted that very request you just mentioned in 2007. There was actually 5 letters that went back and forward, not just one. Well, obviously not just one, but I know the researcher that actually submitted that, and he just gave up, and that was fine. But it was.
Yeah. It looks like he gave up. I'm looking at.
Yeah, he had to. Yeah, there was actually 5 letters going back and forward, and it does appear when you read it in a certain way, like you just read that. Then that's the key line. But it does appear that they sort of admitted that we do have records on Richard C. Doty, but we obviously can't release them. It's privacy. The other thing is you've got to understand. I mean, my instant reaction was, oh my God, Doty worked for or was loaned to the CIA for whatever reason. It may simply be something really innocuous, like it might be, the documents that they have that they're choosing to deny releasing may be like letters to the CIA from Richard Doty himself. You know, they could be sort of like synopsises of the whole Richard Doty story, or they could be a request that someone from the CIA, you know, like try and work with Richard Doty. I don't know what. It doesn't necessarily mean that Richard Doty actually, I guess, worked for them, or there's, you know, we're talking about thousands of pages here. I don't think we will be, but you know, I don't know.
And just for the folks listening, Richard Doty is widely believed to be the person responsible, at least in part, for material like the MJ-12 documents and the Serpo material.
Okay, yeah, and I just wanted to bring up something that's still kind of related to what we're talking about, just kind of go back a little bit, and that is regarding Larry Bryant. He's known for having had a case, a legal case that was ended up in the CIA archives, and that strange court case was titled, "An application has been filed in court here demanding that the Air Force release the remains of the extraterrestrial being or beings it is alleged to be holding in secret custody." Pentagon officials said that is an article that was written on the legal case that Larry Bryant brought against the U.S. government, insisting that there were ETs being held against their will. And that was a curious article that was written for Reuters, published July 14th, 1983, details an alleged abduction of extraterrestrial creatures by the U.S. government. And I just wanted to also let folks know a little bit more about the enigma called Mr. Larry Bryant, and that is he was a former director for the Washington, D.C. office of Citizens Against UFO Secrecy, as Paul Dean knows so well. He was also a civilian federal employee for over 30 years. Bryant has researched the area of ufology for many years from his home in Alexandria, Virginia. He has published hundreds of articles, and these reports range from personal and long sought-after FOIA requests. His other reports are empirical and investigative research regarding ufology and extraterrestrial subject matters. And his extensive blog can be found on Tumblr, as I said. And the article detailing this extraordinary court case about extraterrestrials in the U.S. military can be found in the CIA archives, or the 7,000-word article I wrote on the CIA, which you can actually go to chanthannah.wordpress.com and look up that CIA article I wrote, which includes Larry Bryant and many, many other stories having to do with CIA intelligence. Paul, we really wanted to thank you for having come onto our show, and wanted to let everybody know about your website, and that is ufosdocumentingtheevidence.blogspot.com. I'm going to input that in the chat so everybody knows where to go. Again, it's ufosdocumentingtheevidence.blogspot.com.
The link to that will be in the video description as well.
Right. And I did want to let Paul know something that's really important. Paul, you know, you really need to be thanked for all of the hard work you've done.
Absolutely.
You've put your heart, basically blood, sweat, and tears, your soul into your work. It's a thankless task. I'm sure you've put all kinds of, not just money, you know, but all kinds of energy and time regarding what you do, hundreds, probably thousands of hours spent, and want to thank you for having done that, enlightened and educated the UFO community for so many years.
Oh, that's all right. Yeah, it is actually quite. It is thankless. It's very, very dry. Sometimes incredibly, very slow, very boring. You've got to remember. You've got to have a really acute memory, and that can be actually very draining. But no, thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Sure.
To come on the show. Yeah, it was good. It was good. I don't even know what time is it. Like, what time is it?
Our time, it's about quarter of 10 my time. I think it's 6:45 in the evening, Chant time.
It is.
Right.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks so much. I appreciate your time, Paul. And, you know, you've got a strong geek following. You know, you might not have tens of thousands of fans, but you've got your hardcore fans. No question about it. Highly respected in the field. No doubt.
Not really very, probably. I don't like, you know, I don't know. Like, it is very, very hard to do what I do. And there's very few people doing it. Like, yeah. Anyway, well, thank you very much.
It's a special calling, but we surely do appreciate it. Thanks so much, Paul.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And there we go. So another
Okay.
successful show in the books, Chant Hannah. What do you think?
Fantastic. That's exciting. And, I just am so impressed with Paul. I just also wanted to mention that UFO Congress this year, I believe they might be doing a vote on Researcher of the Year. And so that's going to be really exciting to find out who they're going to vote for. Personally, there's a few people I wanted to mention that I think deserve the vote. If there was a possibility regarding voting on many people at once. In other words, they all get the trophy.
They should. They should make it special this year, like they did with that Walt Disney Oscar, where they gave the big Oscar and then the little dwarf Oscars.
Right.
For Snow White.
I agree. Yeah. And the folks that I would vote for are Paul Dean, Keith Basterfield, Isaac Coy, hands down. All these folks, and then also the wonderful but low key Larry Bryant, who has to be the quietest researcher of all. And then I would say Paul Dean is after that. He's an extremely quiet guy.
Yep. And I am pulling for, with all due respect to Paul, I am pulling for Dave Beatty.
Yes, of course.
I think,
thank you so much for having
Dave
mentioned him.
came from out of nowhere. Out of nowhere, actually. And not really. He'd been in UFOs for a while. Just took a step back, then jumped back in. And he has had a great year.
I want to talk about him for a second. It's really important everybody understand what Frank means by that. And that is he did a wonderful documentary that is only one known of its kind. And he did that. It's USS Nimitz Encounter. And it's about that Tic Tac event that occurred and that we've been talking about. And that actually hit Amazon. I think it was it late last year?
Well, it was on YouTube late last year, and it picked up almost 1.5 million views in virtually a matter of weeks.
Now, that is astounding.
It is astounding.
And
it is.
He's not making a dime off that, by the way, and he put so many hours into that. He's such a wonderful person also. All these folks are. So, yes, Dave Beatty for sure. Are there any other researchers you'd like to bring up, by the way?
Those are the guys. I mean, there's some others out there that have come along and that have done a really good job, but let's, in the end, there can only be one, just like the Highlander tournament. So we will see. we will see what the UFO Congress comes up with. But they couldn't go wrong with either Dave or Paul or Keith. No question about that. Over the last year or so, no doubt about it. They've had very, very good years.
Now, I wanted to bring up an interesting topic, which we'll just talk about briefly, because I know you want to wrap this up soon. But UFO Fest, which is McMinnville, I think that's Oregon, they're going to be holding that. I think it's going to be this weekend. They're going to have some really interesting speakers there. I wanted to mention what speakers they are, because they have a speaker that absolutely astounded me that is going to be there. It's Bob Lazar. Bob Lazar, former government physicist, alleged government physicist. He made headlines, as everybody knows, in the late 80s. He came forward via George Knapp regarding reverse engineering alien propulsion systems for the U.S. military. There were 9 crafts that he said he saw at Area 51, rather S4s, where he said he saw them inside of airplane hangars. And he also claims to have worked for Los Alamos Labs in New Mexico. So it's interesting that he's going to be at UFO Fest. And I actually had wanted to attend that event. I might still. We'll see if I get down there. But there's also Commander David Fravor, who's going to be there, Daniel Myrick. David, I think, is it Pilates? I can never say his last name.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name.
We'll
George Knapp is going to be there.
Yes, thank you.
Jeremy Corbell is going to be there.
Right.
Peter Davenport is going to be there. So, it looks like they've got a really good lineup there, no doubt about it.
They do, yes. And I just wanted to let everybody know that if you want to see a really interesting event that will never probably ever happen again in our lifetimes, and you want to see Bob Lazar talk, they have not sold out on tickets regarding that. I would go if I can. I might still go, but also wanted to mention one thing. I noticed there was one female at this event, And I'm not going to take them to task over that. I'm just mentioning it'd be nice to see a few more females. There's one lady that's going to be there by the name of Joanne Clarkson. I'm sure she'll have a fascinating talk while she's there. But, we need to also give these folks the benefit of the doubt. It's quite possible that, they tried to reach out to more female speakers regarding the topic of ufology and other phenomena, but they weren't able to actually achieve that. So I'd like to see more females involved in conventions, and I know that UFO Congress will have that. They have a lot to say, and it's just always nice to hear them have a chance to give a talk. Anyway,
and since
Frank,
you mentioned that, the females, it looks like at the end of this month, the 31st, they are finally going to premiere the Unidentified TV show. With the stars, Tom DeLonge and Lou Elizondo. But it looks like they've got an interview featuring the infamous anonymous female pilot. She's not necessarily going public, but they are apparently she long it's been talked about. No, she'll never come forward. She'll never, but it looks like they've got at least an interview with her. She may not reveal her identity, but at least she is going on camera and recounting her side of things. She was the other pilot when Dave Fravor was out there rendezvousing with the Tic Tac UFO. So that should be pretty interesting. And we'll have a lot of stuff, I guess, starting in June, where we'll likely do some in-depth reviews of the different shows that they've got coming out. So we will see. We're definitely looking forward to that. We've got at least we may do a show between now and the end of the week, depending on what your plans are related to Oregon. But for sure, we'll be back next Monday night with Calvin Parker. That's going to be a lot of fun. And we've got some other shows lined up. I don't have the schedule in front of me, but stay tuned. I mean, we'll spam around, so you'll know when they're coming up. But for sure, at the very least, we'll be back next Monday at the latest with Calvin Parker. So that's going to be a lot of fun. So, go ahead.
We do also just want to mention one last thing. That is, we do have Mark D'Antonio, and I think we may have Tom Whitmore. Regarding the topic of MJ12 coming up. So that's going to be an interesting interview. And Mark D'Antonio, I believe he's an astronomer. He has some really fascinating things to say. I always love listening to him because he always talks about things from the perspective of pure science. So that's
we'll be ready. We'll be ready to go for those. I think we did a real nice job. Paul's always great. You can't do a bad interview with Paul. So I think we did well. And Chant, are we about ready to wrap up? I think I'm ready to go.
I just want to thank everybody for having listened tonight. Really appreciate your taking the time, taking your time out of your day to come and listen to us, because we want to make sure that we get only the best guests to you. And so it's just really wonderful to spend this kind of time with you. So thank you very much. We appreciate you very much.
Good night, everybody. Bye-bye now.